You define virtual reality, and this is important as we move forward in the conversation, as an interactive computer-generated space that immerses the user in the three-dimensional virtual world. Using this definition, you argue further that virtual reality is genuine reality and that you can lead a fully meaningful life in a virtual world. So thinking about this second point, rather than trying to kind of recreate non-virtual life in virtual space, what for you is unique and positive about life in a virtual world?
Yeah, some people just want to use, well, first of all, thanks so much for organizing this event. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's such a pleasure to be here in Paris at the American Library. Yeah, so the central thesis of this book really is that virtual reality is genuine reality, and that has a number of strands. First, that what happens in virtual reality is real, that is meaningful. And here I'm trying to engage with a long tradition of people saying that, yeah, virtual worlds, virtual realities are just fake or fictional realities. They're just illusions or hallucinations. You'll find versions of this view actually throughout the history of philosophy. I mean, not about computers per se, but you find people talking about virtual worlds of dreams or illusions in ancient Chinese, Indian philosophy. But now modern technology just makes these issues come alive. We all actually hang out, and anyone who's played a video game has at least hung out in a virtual world. And if you've ever strapped on one of these virtual reality headsets, then you've interacted in a virtual reality. So yes, so my first step is really just try to get up to par, at least, that a virtual world could be as good as physical reality. Say you had a virtual world that was indistinguishable in every respect from a physical reality, then I'd want to be able to I'd want to at least make the case that life there could be as meaningful as life in a corresponding physical reality. I guess now you're asking, okay, what is actually distinctive? What makes it better? This is, to be fair, this is one possible meaning of reality plus, not exactly the one I intended. The main one I intended was, yeah, there are lots of realities out there, not just ordinary physical reality. There's like a cosmos, a multiverse of virtual realities, which we can think of as reality plus. But yeah, one possible reading of reality plus is that virtual reality may actually be better than physical reality.
Well, given your prediction of the end of the century, it does seem that your vision of reality plus is better than possibly the reality. So, but let's say today, and casting aside, so you mentioned that your project is to say, we could live as much in reality as in the real world. And one response might be, well, we can't taste, we can't touch, and you kind of cast that away and say the technology will come, the technology will support this. We're going to return to that argument later, but for now, what actually is, I guess you use your term,
better
what's
right
plus? Now? What's plus about reality plus?
About right now, the technology, and I mean the technology in 2022 is pretty clunky, to be fair. It's pretty primitive. You've got to strap on a boxy headset onto your head, and the things you interact with, the physical realities are often quite cartoonish, and so on. That said, during the pandemic, I hung out with a number of friends in virtual reality quite regularly. 8 of us would meet out from around the world and enter a virtual space. Now, if it hadn't been for a pandemic and we hadn't been all around the world, we could have done just that in a physical space, but in fact we didn't. So at the very least, the virtual reality at that point had the advantage of convenience. Many people now, workspaces, I guess, companies like, especially the tech companies, are increasingly trying out having meetings inside VR. So at the very least, convenience and minimizing travel. But if that was all there was to it, that would be rather boring. I mean, you get to have amazing new experiences that you could not have in the physical world. For example, you can fly in virtual reality. People you can teleport, you can, but maybe more interestingly, you can inhabit new kinds of new bodies. In some of the social VR applications like VR chat is probably the biggest one right now. A whole lot of it is actually about people experimenting with different avatars, sometimes different forms of human embodiment. Sometimes they embody themselves as, animals or plants or who knows what. And people find these experiments in embodiment really quite meaningful, I think, and it corresponds to things which are often harder to do in physical reality. Sometimes for people, that's a precursor to trying to do the same kind of thing in physical reality, maybe find new forms of expression and identity there. But being able to try this first in VR is something which is already meaningful. That said, I would not claim for a second that life in VR in 2022 is superior to life in physical reality. I don't think I want to say, even in the long run, one is better than the other. But I'd like to say that each of them has uniquely appealing aspects.
Right. No, and it's true. And you point out you've assumed a female body, you've flown like a bird, you've traveled to Mars, you've inhabited the inside of a human brain. I mean, these are remarkable things, even if the technology is, as you say, clunky. Thinking more about this idea of technology, and then of course you are a philosopher, you describe the book as a project in technophilosophy. Mm-hmm. You write that philosophy helps to shed light on mostly new questions about technology, and technology helps to shed light on mostly old questions about philosophy. So writing this book for you, David, what are the most important new questions about technology? And what are the most important old questions about philosophy that are raised?
Yeah, so I think of technophilosophy as a two-way interaction between technology and philosophy, using technology to shed light on traditional philosophical questions and using philosophical analysis to shed light on philosophy. Here, actually, my inspiration is the Canadian-American philosopher Patricia Churchland, who back in the 80s talked about neurophilosophy. Very much the same idea, using thinking philosophically about neuroscience, but also using neuroscience to shed light on philosophical questions. In principle, I think that's been a fairly successful project, and I think the same thing is possible for technology. So, yeah, for thinking philosophically about technology, I guess the technology I focus on the most in this book is obviously virtual reality technology, but I mean, but a lot of this stuff extends, for example, to augmented reality technology, where, say, you're in touch with the physical world, but it's augmented with virtual objects, with AI, artificial intelligence technology, not to mention things like mobile phone technology and the internet, computers more generally, all those things come up. But I think, yeah, the central focus is virtual reality technology, which raises questions like, is it real? I try to argue, yeah, virtual worlds are real. Is it meaningful? I try to argue, yeah, you can have meaningful life in a virtual world. Is this something that, how should we actually organize our lives in these virtual worlds? And well, that's such a huge question, but I try and say a few things about it. So yeah, I guess that's the technology half. But to be honest, the reason I wrote the book probably wasn't so much that, but actually was more the other half. Using technology as a way to shed light on some very traditional philosophical questions about reality. So just René Descartes challenged, how do you know anything about the external world? Descartes in his Meditations in 1641 said, how do you know anything about the world outside yourself? How do you know that you're not dreaming right now? How do you know this is not an illusion? How do you know that, couldn't it be that an evil demon is fooling you into thinking all this around you is real when none of it exists? The modern version of that is, how do you know you're not in a simulation right now? How do you know you're not in a virtual reality? And my view is actually, it's very hard to know you're not in a simulation or a virtual reality right now. The technology is getting better and better. In the end, it will be indistinguishable. So I don't want to press on that. Where I end up pressing in responding to Descartes is through this idea that virtual reality is genuine reality. if you take that on board, then these Cartesian arguments kind of take as a premise that virtual realities or simulations or dreams or whatever are not genuine realities. Once you take on board this idea that what happens in a virtual world is real, then these Cartesian challenges, how do you know all this isn't a simulation, no longer seems such a challenge. It no longer seems to undermine so much of what we knew. It's like, yeah, maybe we are in a simulation right now. Maybe all this is a virtual reality. I certainly don't rule that out. I think it's a serious possibility. But if we are, Descartes would then say, if we are, then none of this exists. There aren't actually chairs and tables and people in this room. Whereas I would say, no, if we're in that scenario, there's still chairs and tables, there's still people, we're still in Paris, life around us goes on. It may have a different metaphysical nature, but nonetheless, all this is real. So yeah, one strand in the book is to try and use this way of thinking to at least get some purchase against this Cartesian, this Cartesian tradition that tends to lead to a kind of skepticism about the external world. I think thinking of virtual reality as genuine reality can actually help to put us more in contact with the external world.
Wonderful. And now you can all see how, as you start to read the book, your mind starts to float elsewhere and your sense of reality starts to become quite weak. I spent much of this week walking around Paris wondering who possibly created it. You mentioned,
but after a little while, it all comes to seem real again. There's this moment when it's, oh my God, all this is virtual, and then it's like, yes, but it's still real, and then you're okay.
And well, I'm okay enough to interview you for now. You mentioned René Descartes, which any of you in the audience or on Zoom, hello to everyone on Zoom as well, would know as kind of one of the major kind of historians ever. You introduce, in many ways, this book is kind of a history of, as you say, reality, real life. And you write that so you introduce the reader to many historical greats from the centuries past and also contemporary discussions about this topic. You also broach many central kind of discussions about topics of philosophy, so knowledge, reality, mind, language, value, ethics, science, religion, and more. For anyone who's maybe coming to philosophy for the first time, or philosophical concepts for the first time, I suppose apart from Descartes, which maybe you wouldn't put him aside, but who or what, I suppose, which philosophers are ones that one needs to know and what kind of concepts?
Yeah, I really tried to write this book so that it could serve as an introduction to philosophy for someone who didn't have much experience in reading philosophy before. I wanted it to somehow be simultaneously a contribution to philosophy and an introduction to these issues. I mean, not least because all of these issues occur in many different philosophical traditions. Versions of them can be found in ancient Indian and ancient Chinese and ancient Greek philosophy, and are addressed again and again throughout the philosophical tradition. And it just seemed to me that to do this properly, actually, you need to engage all those ideas. And in doing that, you'd basically be bringing in ideas from so many different places in the philosophical tradition that you might as well, you basically have to write an introduction to philosophy to do it properly. So that's what I tried to do to at least some extent. So yeah, so I start with those three traditions that I mentioned: ancient Chinese, ancient Indian, and ancient Greek philosophy, where maybe two of the major philosophers, at least in the case of Chinese philosophy, the philosopher who plays the biggest role is Zhuangzi, who has his famous allegory of the butterfly. I had a dream, I was a butterfly flitting about, then I woke up and here I was, solidly and unmistakably Zhuangzi. But then how do I know that I am Zhuangzi, who just dreamed he was a butterfly? Maybe I'm a butterfly who's now dreaming that he's Zhuangzi, which is just a beautiful way of posing that question. How do you know I'm not dreaming right now? in the ancient Greek tradition, there's Plato's classic allegory of the cave, where people are prisoners, chained to the cave wall, watching shadows on the cave wall. And what we experience of reality is a mere set of shadows flickering about, where the real reality is outside. Of course, that's very structurally analogous, reminiscent of ideas about virtual reality. And in fact, by the way, one nice thing about this book is it has amazing illustrations. I got an illustrator, Tim Peacock, who is incredible, to take a whole lot of the ideas from the book and turn them into vivid illustrations, and they're fantastic. If you don't like the text in the book, just go to the illustrations. They're amazing. And one thing that Tim came up with was actually an illustration of Plato's cave in the form for the 21st century, where the prisoners are just looking at virtual reality. They're all stuck. We've got 3 prisoners stuck inside VR headset, and then there's someone running the whole VR show who looks suspiciously like Mark Zuckerberg.
But this is a great point, because not only do you kind of encourage your readers to engage with the illustrations, but you also openly encourage maybe readers who are new to philosophy to skip around the book as they like. So you say, maybe read the first couple of chapters, and then you don't necessarily have to read the following chapters in order. I mean, I imagine for you, you say in your acknowledgements that much of this research and many of these ideas were formed in the classes you were teaching at NYU and conferences and talks you were giving in other universities. How for you, David, do you translate dense academic philosophical concepts, apart from illustrating them, to a kind of lay audience?
Yes, illustrating. It's interesting you bring that up about the skipping about. I fully expected when I wrote this book that no one would read it from cover to cover. I thought, readers these days, who reads a book from cover to cover? It's like, no, people will dip in, they'll read a chapter here and there, and so on. But now, actually, one thing I've discovered since writing the book is a lot of people do read books from cover to cover, and I've been, encountering reviews online saying, "He's like, this book is really long." And I was like, well, I didn't know you were going to do that. I guess people listen to audiobooks and then they really go all the way through and so on. Maybe I need the hypertext version. But yeah, I did encourage people to skip around, because there's many sub books in there, depending on which issues you want to concentrate on. But one thing I found really helpful actually in conveying these ideas to a broad audience, I tend to actually think abstractly. But I know perfectly well that in writing this kind of book, you have to think concretely and put things in terms of concrete cases and situations people at least have some familiarity with. And what I actually found the most useful there was science fiction. Yeah. So many of these ideas have been explored in science fiction, whether it's the Wachowski sisters, The Matrix, which everyone is familiar with these days, or Stanislav Lem, or Asimov and Heinlein, Ursula Le Guin. I found just so many scenarios in science fiction that I ended up relying on. At least every chapter, I tried to start with a concrete scenario, often from science fiction, sometimes a philosophical thought experiment, and then use that case as a way in to thinking about the philosophical issues. And I mean, as a philosopher, I'm already a fan of the thought experiment, the scenario that you sketch. I already just sketched 2. There was Granger's butterfly and Plato's cave. Amazing thought. You put forward those scenarios and you say, now, what's going on there? Is it an illusion? Is it real? And you think philosophically about it. But yes, science fiction writers are just such great devisers of thought experiments. I mean, in a way, every science fiction work is a kind of thought experiment. Just say things were like this, just say we had, robots like that, or a society like this, then what will follow? So I just found that a great resource for putting forward philosophical thought experiments. And then it's just a matter of trying to think reasonably clearly about them without using too much in the way of jargon.
Right. Just thinking briefly, thinking more about which philosophers do we need to know, which concepts might we need to know. I was really struck and fairly moved by your recognition of some of these neglected philosophers in your acknowledgement. So Suzanne Langer, Michael Heim, and Philip Zay. Can you talk about their contributions briefly, and why do you think they were neglected? And more broadly, you know, I think the kind of the narrative of great men doing great philosophy is starting to become, and rightly so, fairly unstable in this century. And this, to me, seems like an opening into that discussion. So can you talk about that kind of lineage and also these unknown philosophers?
Yeah, so in the last 10 or 20 years, I think there's been a lot of attention to paying more attention to neglected philosophers in the canon. You know, there is this tradition of thinking about philosophy so that, you know, the only ones, there's only like 10 who really matter or something, or in the modern period there's like your classic 7, and I think people are now finding, okay, that's got to be wrong. There's just something wrong with thinking about philosophy that way. There are so many rich contributions to philosophy, and there's particularly been a special attention to looking at the role of women in the history of philosophy. It turns out that throughout the history of philosophy, there have been really significant contributions by women, especially in the last few hundred years. A couple of amazing books just came out earlier this year on four Oxford philosophers who are women: Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, and Mary Midgley. And what's the name of the 2 books? One was called Metaphysical Animals. The other one, two great books about how these 4 women made transformative contributions to ethics in the 20th century. And that plays some role. They play some role in the ethics chapter of my book as well. But another one who plays a really big role is Suzanne Langer, who's a philosopher I didn't know that much about until maybe 5 or 10 years ago, once I started thinking about virtual reality. She really theorized. She was primarily known as a theorist of art, wrote about painting and sculpture and architecture and dance, actually, synthetically about all the arts. But in each of these domains, she theorized that domain as a domain of the virtual. In fact, I think she may be the person who introduced the word virtual world, at least introduced that word into philosophy. And she held that in some sense, every painting or sculpture involves a virtual world. She talked about virtual spaces, virtual activities. So I went through Langer's books on the virtual really and found them very useful resources. And in fact, I paid tribute to her by having an illustration of Suzanne Langer playing the virtual reality game Beat Saber. I don't know if any of you have got inside a VR headset and played Beat Saber, but Langer talks about the illusion of dance, which is the fundamental illusion that the illusion of power, actually, is what she calls it, I think, in the case of dance. The illusion you're actually doing something when you're not. So she would have thought of Beat Saber as a prime. She didn't actually talk about VR technology, but she would have thought of Beat Saber as a prime example of this. So we have an illustration like that. Another one, another philosopher who comes up more recently, Suzanne Langer was working, her central work was the 40s and 50s. Another philosopher who's not well known at all, but wrote a great book on virtual reality in the 1990s was Philip Zhai, or actually Zhai Zhenming, he goes by now. I think he was teaching at University of Kentucky at the time, but now he's at Sun Yat-sen University in China. And he wrote this great book called Get Real, something like Adventures in Virtual Reality, which I think looks like from the outside like a fairly light piece of work, but I think it's actually full of insights. And I try to engage with that at a few points. And he hasn't written much about this for the last 20 years or so, but I was delighted that recently he was actually invited to write a commentary on this book. And now he just maybe a week or 2 ago sent me his commentary on my books. Now we're going to be able to go back and forth on some of these issues, because he actually got there first on some of my central theses.
That's fantastic. I'm really glad you bring up Suzanne Langer and the idea of ethics and values, because that's where I want to go next. So your book falls into many kind of main strokes, let's say, and this is the 6th part of your book. So value, ethics, the study of right versus wrong. You ask the questions: when is it morally permissible to create a simulation? What are our moral responsibilities as creators of a simulation? In your introduction, David, you wrote that perhaps, and we kind of alluded to this at the beginning of the conversation, perhaps our planet will, by the end of the century, or maybe even sooner, depending on how optimistic you are about the forecasts, be crowded and degraded, and virtual worlds will provide us with new landscapes and new possibilities. So there you write kind of optimistically. One argument against this, I'm sure someone's put this argument to you before, but shouldn't we try to fix the ills, which is to say climate change? And you also mentioned in a fairly bleak opening to chapter 17, nuclear war, a hard scrabble existence, this kind of state of war. Shouldn't we try to fix the ills of this environment before investing in other environments? And maybe by actually investing in other environments, we are contributing to the ills of this environment by wasting that energy.
Yeah, I should preface this by saying I'm very far from an expert on the domain of values and ethics and politics. In fact, I think before writing this book, I'd never written anything really about these fields. So I go in there very tentatively, and yeah, some readers of the book have received it that way. One reviewer of the book, Kiran Setia, who's himself an ethicist, reviewing it in the Times Literary Supplement, said, "Outside of ethics, Chalmers is a joy." But yeah, very clear. Don't take anything I say about ethics too seriously, and about values and political issues. But I did try and think through those issues to some extent. And you raise you raised the question of is thinking about virtual worlds in this way somehow a distraction from thinking about these more pressing issues? And whenever I hear objections of this kind, which are really quite common, my reaction is always, there's a nice meme out there which has the text, "Why not both?" Yeah. We're capable of thinking about more than one thing at a time, and collectively we have a lot of resources for thinking about things. So I don't see why it's inconsistent to work as hard as possible on making the physical world attractive, but B, work as hard as possible on making virtual worlds attractive. That needn't be as an escape hatch from the physical world. But hey, if that was one of the bonuses, that if we managed to wreck the physical world, then we'd have a backup. I don't know. Maybe there's a line of thought where somehow doing this would give us an excuse not to worry about the physical world, in the same way that, I don't know, geoengineering or something, people think will give people an excuse not to minimize emissions and so on. I mean, I don't think that would be rational, and I think there's only one version of physical reality. So we've got to take care of physical reality, even if there's going to be a virtual reality. Even if we are going to spend a lot of time in virtual reality, our virtual realities are going to be anchored in physical reality. They're going to be running on computers inside physical reality. If physical reality gets too unstable, virtual reality will too. So I in no way think of all this really as a competition, virtual reality versus physical reality. But maybe the same issue comes up for thinking about going to the moon or going to Mars, right? Some people have this reaction: oh, we shouldn't be thinking about going to Mars, we should be worrying about the Earth. But my reaction is always, why not both?
No, so this is, we hear this kind of, I just wanted to put it to you and hear what you had to say. So if that critique doesn't stick, David, and we can all kind of understand why not both, that's great. We are capable of holding the differences in the society, something we all might want to do more of, it has been said. So in the interest of making this a kind of really airtight philosophical argument, what for you is the most compelling argument against VR as a technology, or the most compelling reason against the belief that VR will not be adopted by the masses as you predict? And what would your response be to that, the best argument against your argument?
Reasons for my argument is really that that virtual reality, life in virtual reality, can be meaningful. I don't really make a prediction that how good or bad it's going to be. I think if it's good, it could be really good. If it's bad, it could be really bad. You know, suffering inside VR is genuine suffering. So really, my main prediction is that the full scope of the human condition will be available. That said, it's very easy to think about ways in which it could go wrong, and yeah, there's any number of science fiction scenarios about this. And I think this is becoming very pressing in the current context, where it looks like, yeah, right now most virtual worlds are controlled by corporations. I mentioned Meta already, right? I mean, Zuckerberg renamed Facebook to Meta to express his ambitions of building the metaverse. And the metaverse, I understand, as basically, you know, this multiverse of virtual worlds, you know, a successor to the internet, where we're going to be inhabiting immersive virtual worlds, or perhaps augmented, using VR technology, or perhaps augmented reality technology, which in some ways I'm all in favor of. But you do need to think about who controls the virtual world. I mean, one theme in the book actually is that the creator of a virtual world is rather like a god of that world. That you know, they're all powerful. They created the world. They're all powerful. They're all knowing, but they certainly needn't be all good. And once you have the scenario of, you know, corporate gods in this metaverse of the future, then you really have to worry about, you know, what their incentives are. Probably rather different from the incentives of the users. And yeah, there's any number of those all-knowing creators are going to raise any number of issues for privacy. Those all-powerful creators will raise issues of, you know, manipulation and autonomy within the virtual world. So if I think of it, yeah, potentially dystopian futures, ones where futures where these worlds are controlled by corporations with their own incentives are among them. And I certainly hope that it's going to be possible to have a future where there are at least a lot of virtual worlds which are somehow user governed, user controlled, somehow democratic. But yeah, the question of how we get there from here is extremely non-trivial.
And you say surely it will be bumpy. So you say that this argument focuses more on kind of VR in principle as opposed to VR in practice. And in practice, you acknowledge the road is sure to be bumpy. No doubt, you write, it will move, which is to say the road, in all sorts of directions I haven't anticipated. Given that, you know, you had to kind of, I wish we had it here, but you had to kind of publish this in a formal, presentable way, and you couldn't possibly kind of put in all the kind of inklings of your mind about these possible directions where the road might go, because they're just simply inklings at this point. What for you, what are some of the thoughts swirling around in your mind about possible directions of this road?
Yeah, you know, some of it depends on the technology, and you know, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on thinking about the future, on thinking about what's going to happen in technology. I do think that a lot of people are excited by augmented reality technology as a way of making virtual reality happen. I mean, VR, you know, the headsets, as I mentioned, are rather clunky, and they cut you off from physical reality, which a lot of people don't like. And even when I go into VR, I'll spend an hour there, maybe max, and then get out, which is very different actually from my experience, say on the regular internet, where I can happily spend 10 hours on the internet, which goes by, and then yeah, that's it's just a addiction and absorption. But I think a lot of people think that what's really going to be transformative with VR technology is augmented reality technology, which is basically, you know, think of it as a glasses form factor. You're in touch with the physical world, but digital objects are projected into the physical world, maybe say for purposes of information. It'll help you recognize people or navigate, or maybe it will just augment the physical world with further tools, like, say, you know, one example I use is musical instruments. one thought is that once we have good augmented reality, this has the potential to replace many, if not most, of our screens, say mobile phones or desktop computers, because anytime you need a screen, it could just be projected in front of you into the world for you to use. And it's easy to imagine this could kind of become the, a future way that we do much of our computing. So that could become, it's not too hard to see a path, maybe 2030, 2040, where that becomes ubiquitous. And then that will also give you the technology for doing seamless virtual reality. So you've got a slider on your glasses, so to speak, for how much opacity you want, how much do you want to be in touch with the physical world, fully transparent to the physical world. That's augmented reality. Dial it down so the physical world is opaque. You're just in touch with the virtual world, and that's virtual reality. So that's a path to widespread usage of virtual reality, which I think is probably more likely than directly going through headsets. But then going into the future after that, we can imagine, say, brain-computer interfaces, where it kind of interfaces directly with what goes on in the brain, and maybe eventually uploading ourselves, uploading the brain and perhaps the body itself to a computer, something which has been explored in any number of science fiction movies, but which is still fairly far off in the future.
So anyone listening to this might think, oh, that sounds a bit far-fetched, possibly. And I would like to remind that person that you might have come across a recent book called The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy-Poole, the journalist. This, of course, so it's now kind of known as this book, but it was previously an academic paper co-authored by you in 1995. At the time when you wrote it, it was rejected by 3 of the kind of major philosophy journals, and now, of course, it's the subject of many popular books and also in also the Academy articles. At the time you write, people treated the argument of the extended mind as an interesting curiosity, too radical to take seriously. People make predictions about the future all the time. You've just made another one. Many of them in our kind of contemporary ways of being strike us as really radical. What, apart from this kind of prediction, what are some predictions that you think actually will come to pass? And given that you're probably very much in the world of radical predictions, what are some that people put to you and even you say will not come to pass?
Interesting. So yeah, I try to get myself out of the, at one point I think I put into the introduction to the book, I'm not here making any predictions, especially about the future. But then I looked at the book and I said, yeah, actually, no, that looks like a prediction. That looks like a prediction. Yeah, I'd like to say that I predicted the smartphone back in the 1990s in that paper on the extended mind. Maybe not quite, but it is a case where this was about the idea that the technology we use can actually become part of our minds, which back in the 1990s everyone found implausible, and then come the 2000s everyone's carrying a smartphone around with them all the time. They use for memory, for navigation, and so on. Now most people seem to think the thesis is, well, come on, that's obvious. It's yeah, we all know this. But well, yeah, actually in a paper I wrote 10 years ago, I made predictions about artificial intelligence, saying that I was more than 50% confident we would have human level artificial intelligence by the end of the 21st century. So by 2100. Actually, I've got to say that was 2010. Since then, AI technology has just moved so fast that I think probably that prediction was very much on the conservative side. And just looking at what's happened for the last 5 years, especially first, there was the Go playing system and the protein folding system, but now these language models that seem to be showing signs of general intelligence. It wouldn't totally surprise me if we had human level. I mean, I think I would at least update it to 50% chance of human level artificial intelligence by 2050, and maybe even 2040. So that's a case where the timelines are actually speeding up because of this progress in AI that nobody predicted, but that has really begun to happen in the last 5 years. And that once that timeline speeds up, once you have AI on the scene actually contributing to the design, say, of VR and other technologies, that actually has the effect of speeding up the timeline for almost everything.
And again, what about a radical proposition that possibly you haven't posited, but somebody else has, that you think just, I mean, even me as David Chalmers, in, let's say I'm in a virtual reality and I choose to be you, and someone comes up to me in the virtual reality and proposes something to me, and I would say, actually, you know, no.
That's never going to happen. Let me think about that.
Something that's maybe circulating now that people are talking about now that you just think, no.
That will never happen. Okay, I mean, certainly I come across any number of things that look like a hype, or there's a lot of hype out there, but hype is just a matter of, but then a lot, which I think, you know, people think things are going to happen overnight. They're not going to happen overnight. You know, the metaverse is not going to be here in any full-scale way in 5 years, and in 2027, it'll still be very primitive. Then in general, I think there's this phenomenon that people tend to overestimate progress in the short term, but underestimate progress in the long term. And that's often my reaction. Yeah, people say things are going to happen in 5 years that might take 20 years. But nevertheless, if you think about what's actually going to happen in 100 years, I mean, compare 2022 to 1922. I mean, who could have predicted all the things that have happened? I mean, actually, there is every now and then someone pulls out a nice piece from 100 years ago where a fair amount of stuff was predicted, but always a lot was not. I don't actually have a great example of hype coming to mind right now, but often it's the timeline that I'm the most skeptical about. If we take away the timeline aspect, say, will this ever happen? Then I think, yeah, there's all kinds of things that will eventually happen. You know, reality is big, the future is big. There's room for so many things to happen.
Thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for David Chalmers? I forgot to mention in all of my excitement at the beginning that we spend at least 15 minutes at the end of these talks opening it up to your questions and comments, whether you're in person or on Zoom. I imagine some of you know this. I recognize some faces. So to the people in the room, are there any questions or comments? Yes.
Hi. Hi. You said that you were basically, your talk is about virtual reality and you know what you thought about how they interact and how they act upon each other. Now, why do you think that is? Is there something neurological in our human brains that actually sets up that way? Because, you know, we do have to let go of reality, I suppose, in dreams and all that sort of stuff. So are we just so empathetic with whatever is, you know, given us in through our stimulation that you know we want to believe it, or are just predisposed to believe it?
Yeah, there are a lot of psychological studies on the way people interact with virtual reality, and it does seem that, yeah, we just like to interpret things as real. The brain is constantly trying to make sense of its environment as real. And if there's a way to do that, it will usually do that. I mean, maybe this is most straightforward in the case of a virtual reality, which is indistinguishable, say, from an ordinary physical reality. If I was in VR, but the headset was feeding me the same kind of signals that my eyes and ears are getting right now, then, you know, it's very natural for my brain to react. It's to be expected that my brain would react to those stimuli much as it reacts now, and give me a sense that, hey, I'm sitting in here in a room talking with you. What's interesting is that even when VR is somewhat more cartoonish and primitive and not yet at this level of richness, we still find that we have this feeling of immersion, of presence. Even if I've been in rather primitive VR conversations, but nonetheless, it always feels like I'm there in the room, yeah, with these people. Even weird things can happen. At one point, you know, things got glitchy and I started flying off into the air and suddenly I was floating by the ceiling. Okay, it didn't exactly feel realistic, but it still felt like, yeah, I was there, floating up by the ceiling. Your brain, I think, just tries to interpret these things as real, and that's roughly what our perceptual systems are designed to do, and they're very powerful. Oh, Patricia Churchland. Oh. Yeah, she calls herself a neurophilosopher. So she's a philosopher, but she's collaborated a lot with neuroscientists. Has a classic book from 1987 called Neurophilosophy.
Have a question from Audrey.
So you're talking about the perceptual system. So using VR, I was struck by how powerful the visual system is for the construction of consciousness and that perception of reality. So people are talking about more senses than we think about, like interoception, proprioception, even balance is a sense. What's the next important sense that will come online in VR to expand our ideas of reality in that world? Yeah, the body is so hard in VR. That is, the bodily senses are really hard. I mean, you can get an avatar in a virtual world, which is in some ways like the physical body, but your senses of the body are so limited. So right now, most VR technology is audio-visual. People have invested. Audio is not that hard, and people have invested a lot in making vision better. But you know, smell and taste are very primitive, and yeah, touch and all the bodily senses are difficult. There are a lot of people working on touch with, for example, haptic technologies, you know, special suits or gloves that will give you that sense of like contact. When you pick something up in VR, and well, standardly, your arm will just go straight through it or something, or you can walk right into another person. So yeah, haptic technology can at least begin to give you special modes of interaction when you encounter, say, your hand picks up a glass inside VR, then the haptic suit will at least give you, haptic glove will at least give you a special kind of interaction for at least a beginnings of a sense of touch. You know, the sex industry, of course, is very big on this because, yeah, you know, sex is obviously very, all kinds of forms of physical contact are very limited in VR. There's this whole field of, I think they call it teledildonics, which is devising technology for simulating aspects of physical contact between bodies, actually using physical devices. My own suspicion is that none of this, all this is going to be really pretty primitive until we get to the point of really good brain-computer interfaces, where all this goes directly to, you get inputs directly to areas of the brain that can somehow affect the representations of the body which are present inside your brain and give you that very real sense that all this is going on in your body. But I mean, that I suspect, Elon Musk founded this company recently, Neuralink, which is devoted very much to brain-computer interfaces. I suspect the technology there is primitive enough. It's probably some decades away. But at that point, then VR begins to get very, very multisensory, very real, very impressive. Yeah, bypassing the physical body, or you might call it investing in the virtual body, allowing that virtual body, which is now dismissed as second class, to have the full powers and the full senses of the physical body.
Yes, you said half of your book was going the other way and seeing how technology may change classic philosophy. So I'd like to know if you notice any impact from technology on the philosophy of Maya.
Ah, interesting. I'm not much impact from technology on the philosophy of Maya. Yeah, you mean the Indian tradition of Maya? Yeah, the work in Indian philosophy that I know the best is work in the ancient traditions, where they didn't know about the computer. So I wouldn't be able to, I don't know about impact of technology on those thinkers, but are there people now bringing in technology and integrating that with the philosophical ideas in the Mayan tradition? I try to, one thing I try to do in the book is to, I take a story from the Mayan tradition, from the Maya tradition, about illusion and reality. It's a story about the sage Narada, who says, I have conquered Maya, I have conquered illusion. And Vishnu, the god, says, come on, I'll show you illusion, and puts Narada, Narada somehow wakes up inside a woman's body and gets to live life as a queen with many sons, children, and grandchildren. 50 years pass. There's a terrible war and her family is killed. And then Narada wakes up again, and it's just 2 minutes later in the external reality. And Vishnu says, I've shown you, I've shown you illusion. Actually, I tried, Tim Peacock in the book managed to illustrate this with an episode of Rick and Morty. Anyone watch Rick and Morty, the animated TV series? They play a video game called Roy, a Life Well Lived, where you get to live a whole life in 2 minutes. And pretty much, it's, as far as I can tell, it's directly ripped off from this ancient Hindu folktale. One thing I try and do in the book is to say that in general, my view is there's less illusion than you think there is. So VR needn't be illusions on my view. And I want to say, even in that case, it's not clear to me that Narada really was experiencing an illusion, but certainly the advocates of Maya are going to push back on that. So yeah, techno Maya may be something whose time has come. I am finding a lot of interest from people who work in Indian philosophy, who I've interacted with quite a lot over the years, whether it's, and actually there's, the Journal of Asian Philosophy is actually going to be publishing a special symposium on this book, and we're going to try and get contributions from people who really know the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, as well as various Chinese traditions, and then we'll see what they make of technophilosophy as an approach.
It's brilliant. We have a question that's slightly related to that in terms of illusion from Johanna on Zoom. Hello to everyone on Zoom. Johanna asks, basically, in a world in which kind of children are going to be growing up surrounded by this technology, in the same way now we can see like a 3-year-old navigating an iPhone and feel slightly scared, I think, sometimes watching these kids navigate technology. She asks, how are we to educate children in such a way that they can make distinctions between the virtual world and the concrete world, given that there have been incidents of young people not being able to make this distinction?
Yeah, I do think it's important that people know when they're in a virtual world and know when they're in the physical world, at least for now. If you just say you're wearing augmented reality glasses, then, and things get really realistic, then you won't always know what's potentially you might not know what's physical and what's digital, which I think can lead to all kinds of problems. Not least, you want to know what you can pick up in the regular way, and there's different modes of interacting with physical and virtual objects. It's not a problem right now because virtual objects always have this rather primitive quality that distinguish them as virtual. But I do think as the technology moves on, my view is that it's very important. If we don't know what's physical and what's virtual, then we will get the illusion, for example, that virtual things are physical. I think it's very important, actually, that right now when we use VR, we know we're using VR so that we actually perceive virtual objects as virtual objects. We perceive physical objects as physical objects. And I think of this as legibility, being able to read, to automatically classify some things as real and some things as virtual. And I think that's probably a recommended constraint on designers of virtual worlds, that it's always clear what kind of world you're in. And I'd hope that's, my sense is, with iPads and so on, kids are actually pretty good for the most part at knowing what's on what's digital and what's physical. But I do think it's probably I don't know if this is a potential regulation or at least a recommendation for designers of virtual worlds, that this always be clear. Likewise, in interacting with, the same issue comes up with interacting with AIs. You know, you're talking to someone online. Is it a bot or is it a human? I don't know about you. I want to know if I'm talking to a bot or a human. So I think this should always be made clear as well.
Thank you so much. Can we have a big final round of applause, please, for David Chalmers?